life's greatest questions seem like a mystery? Well, we're probably going to talk about it here at Appalachian Liturgy. Important questions like, are you a Jedi or an Imperial? Is oatmeal actually a breakfast cereal? Is a Catholic weekday really called a ferial? Did you know that Mr. Rogers was Presbyterial? So join us as we have a little fun talking about thy kingdom come. Appalachian Liturgy.
Okay, welcome everyone to the Appalachian Liturgy podcast. I am Justin Stacy.
I'm Brooke Ashley.
And I'm Justin Bowling.
And tonight, I guess, is Olympic night. Brooke,
Yay!
she wanted to talk something related to the Olympics. We decided that we would do the global church, so representing all the nations, I guess, in the Olympics. But first, let's talk about the Olympics. Brooke, I know you're a huge fan.
Yes.
Myself, I am not a huge fan. And Bowling, I think you maybe are. So, yeah, let's start with that.
So, we look forward to the Olympics so much that we kind of base things around it. Like, we would never take a vacation during the Olympics unless the Olympics were part of the vacation. Like, we would know that we were watching the Olympics. During the Winter Olympics, I lose so much sleep because curling is usually broadcast late at night, and I think that's the greatest thing ever.
Curling is great in 4-year doses, like once every 4 years. That's the perfect amount of curling.
Yes, it's the perfect amount of curling. But I love, like, I've watched almost every minute of the opening ceremonies. Like, there's just something about watching all of the nations marching in under their flags and assembling together, and you've got countries that have been at war that are, sitting next to each other or at least in the same room. The stories behind the Olympics. I mean, I love the fact that there are people who go out there and give it their all and know that the chance of them even getting a medal is slim to none, but they still want to participate in it. Like, I love everything about it.
Yeah, for me, I love the stories that when you're watching it and they start telling these people's background, you're like, oh my gosh, this is like an amazing personal story. And it's just like that after one after another type thing.
And I love, like, the costumes that people wear when they're coming in for the Parade of Nations. I mean, it's just, I don't know. And I love learning about the culture of wherever the Olympics are happening at the time and all of the symbolism behind, the way they do the medals and the medal ceremonies and how they present the medals. I mean, there's so much behind it all. Plus, then you just have the sports. I mean,
and it's so patriotic too. I feel like there's the 4th of July and the most patriotic holiday, and then like very slightly below that's where the Olympics are. Because it's Team America all the way when it comes to Olympic time. It doesn't matter what happens. We gotta win the most medals.
So, Stacy, there's nothing about the Olympics that you like?
No, I wouldn't say that. And I would say that one of the reasons why I don't necessarily like the Olympics is most all the sports that are played in the Olympics, I just don't care about.
Okay.
I don't care about swimming. I don't care about anything like that. I do, like, for example, I have been following the basketball part of the Olympics. And it's, I like basketball somewhat, and I'm definitely pulling for Team USA. My second place just got booted out. That was Slovenia. I like Luka. I like Luka Doncic quite a bit. So I was kind of pulling for him as well. But so I think it is more so. I just don't care about the sports that they play, other than the major ones that are in our identity, our American identity, I guess. But I will say that this probably goes back to my childhood, where my mom, I think my mom, my grandma, both my grandmothers, my aunt, they all complained when it was the Olympics because it was always taking off the daytime soap opera.
Their stories.
Yes, exactly. They were always complaining. They hated it. And I always heard that. And, I wasn't watching it then either, but I heard that. And it was like, in the back of my mind, I have no reason to watch this because this is a negative thing. Like, this is taking off our days of our lives is what this is doing.
In my family, it was opposite. I mean, even growing up, the Olympics were a huge deal. We would have family Olympic competitions, and we had this huge family. I mean, my grandfather would even, like, make medals And so one year, my sister and I decided that we were going to try our hand at synchronized swimming, or they call it artistic swimming now. And let me just tell you, that is hard stuff. But we like put this whole routine together and premiered it for our family at my grandparents' pool. And so there are a couple sports that I don't really care much about. Handball, I don't really understand handball. Like, handball looks like to me something just some youth director has needed to fill time one Sunday night with their youth and is just like mushed all of the sports together. And so you have like elements of all these sports. So I need to learn the rules about that. But the swimming, like, I can't believe you don't like the swimming.
I know.
Aaron and I scream and yell at the TV. Like, he was asleep and there was I think it was one of the relays, and I'm like on my knees in our bed at like 11:30, like silent screaming at the TV because it was so great. So
like the 1500, I think this was the first year they had ran that one. We were
yes,
watching that one. It was so long. They took a commercial break in the middle of the event that the thing was so long. How do you swim for that long?
Now, I love the cycling in the palindrome. Okay, Stacy, if you have not seen that, you have to look up the cycling. It's not the road cycling, it's the palindrome, and it is crazy fast and all this strategy, and it's just really cool to watch.
And they have the martial arts. I have no earthly idea what's going on. The rock climbing, I don't know all the rules or what makes something happen, but like, I think the spectacle of the oddity of the sports is also part of the appeal, because you don't see this stuff anywhere else. And then you find out, oh, there's actually like this niche group of people who practice this all the time and have been preparing for years for this moment type thing.
Like badminton.
Cool. Yeah.
I mean,
there's some awesome
badminton that you see in the Olympics is not the badminton that we all played in PE in school.
Yeah, where's everybody yelling at each other? And
yeah, or ping pong, table tennis. You know, I mean,
yeah. In Stacy's defense, I will say this year I've watched it probably less than I have, and I don't know if it's because I think there's a couple reasons. One is I just haven't like mentally figured out the time zone difference. I don't know when something's live, when something is, I know the result of. I don't know if it's like the internet part to where like I'll get a notification earlier in the day that says, you know, I like an example was Simone Biles finishes third with bronze, and that hadn't came on TV yet. I didn't want to see that. So why do I want to watch it now that I already know what happened?
Yeah, that's been an unfortunate thing about like all of the basketball games. I haven't really got to watch them. I mean, I can watch them now, but it's after I already know the result. So
yeah.
So I have been part of hashtag Team No Sleep for the U.S. Women's National Team, and I haven't necessarily been getting up. Like today's match was at 4 a.m. and I didn't get up at 4 a.m. but I got up early enough so that I could watch the match before I had to do anything else productive. So it was still pretty early. But I have to completely stay off any kind of social media or any of my news things. And so that has been an issue. So, but yeah, I mean, rugby, holy crap. I mean, those guys are crazy.
I'll take my pads, please, when I get
back.
I know, right?
Seems like a very dangerous sport.
Well, and I think love the fact that there are sports that are super popular in other countries that like we don't know anything about.
Yeah.
You know, like handball and those that aren't mainstream here, but you know, they have a huge following other places. And I mean, even things like women's volleyball and beach volleyball, like there are professional leagues in other countries where our US players are going and making a living playing this sport. Whereas, you know, I just don't know that here in America, people are going to pay to go watch volleyball. Like, I mean, I love volleyball to play it and it's fun to watch, but I don't know that I'm going to have a rooting interest.
Right.
Not to say anything bad about volleyball, but.
Right. It is interesting how nations kind of form a sport identity to where this is, you know, when you think of America, you think of American football, you think of baseball, you know, basketball. But, you know, I would say that soccer would even be a lesser category in America, even though it's popular here. Though. It's growing fast. Yeah. But in Europe, my goodness, like their Super Bowls is in football, you know, so it is really, really interesting, that part of it. And I think ultimately it's just because I haven't given the Olympics a chance that I probably, you know, maybe I should. So maybe next year I will, but I don't know.
You got to wait 4 years, or actually
next
just
summer.
3
That's
now.
right.
It's just next 1 year for the winter.
Yeah.
There you
The
go.
Winter Olympics, I mean, I love them, but I have to do a lot more research on some of the sports.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm a sucker for the Summer Olympics too. That's my favorite.
Yeah. Although I have noticed that I have been less interested in the track and field this year.
No
than I
Usain
have
Bolt
in the
though. That's what it
past.
has to be, right?
Do what?
I'm no Usain Bolt. That's what it has to be, right?
Well, you know, and I started really questioning because I used to run track like at a high level. Like I used to travel all over the place running. And so it was a big deal. And here's what I think it is. I don't see the camaraderie and the team spirit in American track as I do in things like American swimming. And in the swimming, I mean, you saw Ledecky be like super pumped because the girl she's been mentoring beat her, right? Like Katie Ledecky was so excited for her mentee. And you don't see that in the track and field events as much, or at least we don't see it in America. So I don't know. I don't know if that's what it is or what it is, but I just haven't been into the track and field as much.
Interesting. All right. I guess let's transition over to what the actual topic is for the night, which is the global church. So I guess where do you all want to start with that?
Well, I think this was kind of my idea. And when I was thinking about it, I just, in talking to folks, especially in our region, in the Appalachian region, we sometimes forget that Christianity is a worldwide religion, that like the United States does not have the end all say about Christianity. And we forget that Christianity is practiced across the world and it looks a little different. There have been some cultural appropriations, just like we have appropriated things for our culture. And it's so easy to mesh Christianity with patriotism. And we've talked about that before. Talked about how the Jesuses hanging in our churches look like Americans. I mean, it's just so watching the Olympics, I think, is a great time to remember that people across the world follow Jesus Christ. That it is just not Americanized kind of thing.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to ask too, is like, is there good things we can take from how we treat the Olympics that we should see more of in our church? And is there, maybe things that we shouldn't treat church the same way we do the Olympics? And I think that you're answering the second question for sure. And that like, we shouldn't, I think the phrase I've heard used a lot is like, we should think of ourselves more as the church in America rather than the American church. And that's a big difference, because like, we're not going, team church, team American church or whatever, we should be saying like, looking as it more of a universal global church, like you said. So like that part of rooting for your team shouldn't apply, but it probably does more so than it should. But is there anything we should take from that, the other end of it? Like, is there anything good that we can take into church that we see in the Olympics that, we can learn from?
I think just realizing that the church is global. It's in most every nation, and we aren't the only part of the church. The American church isn't the church. It's just a limb of it, So I think taking the Olympics as the example, realizing that there are other teams and we are really all in the same boat. We are fighting the same fight. We are competing the same game.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to follow,
and we're not even competing. We're not even competing. I guess we shouldn't look at it as a competition, but yeah, we are all trying to follow Christ. And yeah, the church does take, I guess, its identity and its flavors after the nations that it's in, the cultures that it is brought up in. But yeah, we should definitely see that we are a part of a global church.
Well, I even think about worship services. I mean, worship services look different in different cultural contexts. I mean, the music's different. The way you go about worship is different. I mean, I don't know if y'all know this, but man, if your worship service is a minute over 60 minutes, the pastor's going to hear about it, or the priest is probably going to hear about it, right? Like, I don't care if it's 60 minutes and 30 seconds you went over. If you've been part of an African worship service or an Asian worship service, honey, it don't matter what time it is. They worship till they're done.
Yeah.
And it can be 2 and 3 hours sometimes, and nobody thinks anything about it. And it's just, I mean, we've talked a little bit about denominational differences, but and I haven't got to experience this, but I have a lot of friends who have, offerings look different when you're in different places. If you go to church in Africa, we've got a lot of Methodist churches in Africa. You're very likely to see live animals as part of those offerings. I mean, it's just it's just different. And two, I mean, you hear stories about where Western missionaries, and Western by meaning North American, Western culture, missionaries going and like forcing folks in different cultures to dress like Americans to come to worship, or building churches like you would here in the United States, without thought of what that meant for the culture or what that looked like, and we got a bad rap. We were trying to do a good thing, right? But we really forgot about the fact that Christianity was worldwide and not just Americanized. So there's some really bad, yucky things that came out of that.
So I have a funny story since you brought up denominational differences. This past weekend, I got my mom to attend church with me at St. Thomas, and it was great. Like she was surprised at some of the things. It's an hour and a half service. That's usually the length of the service. She was surprised at some of the things that went on because she wasn't familiar with it. Like she wasn't familiar with the Eucharist celebration ceremony, like at the end with, because really the biggest portion of the service is probably towards the Eucharist, right? Mm-hmm. So she thought that was awesome that was the case. But she said that the one thing that she didn't really like was that there was no sermon. And that's the way she worded it. There was no sermon. And I was like, yeah, there was. I was like, it was in the middle. And, Father Boyd talked about masks, and it was referencing the Old Testament with, I think 2 Samuel was the verses for the day. And I was like, he was referencing all that. And I was like, she's like, but yeah, it was like, she's like, it was 10 minutes tops. She's like, that's not a sermon. And I'm like, so, it really, and that's a denominational difference, right? Because she's used to the majority of the church service being the sermon. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of funny. And, I think that would be the case if we went to a church service in another country. I think for the most part. Now, bowling with like Catholic Mass, like isn't part of the idea is to try to keep it as close to the same as possible in different countries, or is there different flavors? I know there's like the Latin Mass, and then there's English and whatever, but the idea is to keep it as close to the same as possible, right? So that you feel like
that's one of the
worship
ideas,
with everyone
of the pre-1960s traditional Latin Mass. The idea was that you are celebrating the same thing as everybody else across the world, to emphasize the universalness of the church. And there's obviously a lot to say for that, and a lot of good things to say for that. But since the vernacular languages are used in more masses, and there's a lot to say for that as well, a lot of the emphasis is on a certain strand of things shared. So like the same readings, the same overall structure of the Mass, but like the songs, and like Brooke is saying, the flavor of the way something is celebrated will be very different in Kenya as in here. And that's an example I use because we've had some Kenyan priests that were here at the rectory, and that they said exactly as much. I remember one getting up when he was about ready to leave. He was telling us his goodbyes and, saying something. He's like, and, clap a little bit more, be a little bit more active. Because that's what he was saying. That's what he was used to. That's what people had done. And he's like, you're too stiff, loosen up a little bit. But yeah, I
Yeah.
like what Brooke was saying too, on a couple things. I feel like the first thing we think of lots of times, unfortunately, is when we think of the global church, people's minds immediately go to missionary work. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we sometimes forget that there's, established Christianity in other places, and there's a lot that we probably can and should learn from them. Because, like you said as well, Brooke, we've appropriated a lot of stuff in our own culture, and sometimes it's hard to see because we're so engrossed in that culture, and we don't see some of the things that we might be doing wrong that we just don't see because everybody's doing the same thing. But if we look in other cultures that don't have the same type of, if we look at Christians in other cultures that don't have those same assumptions, we can learn a whole lot from them. Like the Corinthian church had its own set of problems that, the church in Ephesus did not have, and they could learn a lot from them. We should be doing the same thing now as they were then. So yeah, and like you said too, Justin, I don't even think it's wrong to compare it necessarily to an event. Paul compared it, running a race, lots of things about our Christianity to sports events, but we're not competing against these other countries. We're all competing together on the same team. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think, with the missionary work, I think the thought process behind that, and I mean, of course, I didn't live through that period of time, but studying it was that we were taking God, as American Christians, we were taking God into these places. And that's a really dangerous thought. One, it's just, full of hubris, but two, I mean, the flip side would then be true. When we left, we were taking God with us back, right? But I really do think that is that egocentric kind of idea of we're a Christian-based society, so wherever we go, Christianity has to look like it does here, so that's
I think one of the dangers, well, probably the biggest danger with seeing ourselves as the church, the only part of the church, we have God on our side, we're taking it to these other countries, is that it doesn't take very much to where we are now wielding the sword in that name. And we've done it throughout history. So, we don't need to go back there. When you start aligning God and the church with your power structure, whatever entity it is, in this case would be a nation, it's very dangerous to do that.
I think it helps us sometimes put things in perspective too. Like, we talk a lot in this country about like religious liberty, and I think there's like a lot of good things we can talk about there and a lot of things worth fighting for there too. But I think it's dangerous to start thinking of ourselves as like ultimately persecuted when you can look across the globe and see Christians who are struggling to, live day to day in certain events. And these are Christians as well that, I mean, and that just because somebody's persecuted worse than somebody else doesn't mean that the lesser one isn't persecuted at all. But at the same time, we can be kind of grateful that we're having these types of fights on such a more scaled down level than
I think this really came home to me. For me, we have a friend who is from the Congo, and he was a United Methodist missionary for many, many years. So not only were we friends before, but then we were colleagues. But he tells a story about watching his father be murdered because his father was a Christian, and so when he hears us talk about being persecuted because a pastor can't lead a prayer at a football game, it's incredibly offensive to him. He's like that, and he's an American citizen now, and and he's like that is not persecution. Persecution is watching your father be murdered while you get the rest of your family to safety because you follow Jesus Christ, so I just it's different. And you're right, Bowling, in that you have to be careful to say that it's not persecution if it doesn't rise to the level of murder or whatever.
But there's perspective there too. To understand what other people are going through too, and not to take for granted what you do have.
I think it's important to look at what's going on in other countries in terms of religious freedom and liberty, and realize how privileged we are and have been to be Christians in this nation. And I think it humbles us. Look at what's been happening in China for the longest time. I think the latest that I've read is that basically only churches that basically pledge their allegiance to the government or something, they're the only ones that are allowed to thrive or to remain open.
Official licenses from
and everyone else is basically shut down and they're forced underground. Look at Japan. I mean, the Olympics is in Tokyo right now, so we probably should talk about Japan. For the past 300-400 years, since the 17th century. Well, I mean, that's when missionaries started.
No, they're not doing that anymore, but
right. That's when it happened. Exactly. Actually, the ban on Christianity was lifted in 1873. So yeah, it's been for a good while. It's been free and open. But before, I mean, watch the movie Silence. That's about Jesuit priests that go to Japan to evangelize and really to start up Christianity, and like the amount of torture and the persecution that they had to go through and that the people that were following them had to go through, it's crazy. And ultimately it led to 2 of them renouncing their faith, which I think is a topic in of itself. And so I guess let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay.
The renouncing of faith in Japan, like, do you think that ultimately is what saved Christianity, or did it hinder it from ever succeeding? So right now, 1% of the Japanese population is Christian. So that's a little over 1 million. But that's way up from what it was, right? So when they started banning and doing all of the persecution stuff, I think it had got up to 500,000 is what I'd read. And then it dwindled down to 20,000 because they were stamping it out. The government was. So in the Silence movie, it seems to, I guess, hint at the Jesuit priests didn't really renounce their faith. They did publicly so that they could stay in Japan. But then basically Christianity just went underground, and it kept a flavor. It looks, it doesn't look a lot like the Christianity of Rome or anything like that. It has its own flavor. There's a lot of, I guess, Buddhist practices in it. But what do y'all think about that? Like, do you think that if would it have been more productive or effective to have just been martyrs versus renouncing your faith and in hopes to keep it alive?
I think unquestionably it would have been more effective, but it would be, I can absolutely see unquestionably how that's way harder too. Like, I mean, when you compare, like you said, compare Japan's Christian population to any other similar, Eastern Asian country, the percentages are not even close.
Yeah.
The percentages in Japan are way less than even China, where there's been constant persecution for decades. It seems that the effect was obvious, that it wasn't a productive long-term goal. I understand how it would be tempting in the context of the Silence movie and book. And from my understanding, like, the author of the book has openly said, maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding is he said that he meant for it to be an open question. Like, it wasn't like he wasn't trying to comment one way or the other. And I think in the movie, it's a little bit more.
It's more
directed,
obvious.
Like Scorsese was when he made the movie, he wanted it to seem like he thought that the missionary made the right decision by renouncing his faith to try to save his parish. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tough situation. It's a sad situation for sure. It's a terribly sad situation. But I have a hard time seeing how, like, as Paul would say, you can't do evil that good may come from it. And
right. Yeah, so, if you believe that renouncing your faith is sinful, then you don't ever do sin to get something good. And I think that's what Paul was talking about.
And not having been there, it's hard to say what was the right thing to do. I mean, so, there would be lots of questions that I would have. Like, how immature were the believers? Like, because if you have real immature believers and you don't have anybody else to come along and lead that, then martyring may have killed it out. I mean, I don't, and I've not seen the movie, so I don't know.
It's a good
But
movie.
it's a hard thing for
y'all
me
should
to
watch it.
Yeah, I know. Aaron probably has, and he'll say that I have, but I probably really wasn't paying attention while I was playing. But
You fell asleep.
let's be honest. But I mean, I think it's hard. I think I would have a hard time renouncing my faith. And I wonder, what you talked about the faith having some really Buddhist kind of flavors to it, and you know, there's a lot of gray there. I don't know. I mean, you see in places like China where the church is on fire. I mean, growing by leaps and bounds, even under real harsh persecution.
Right.
And I think that's a perfect example, like, because it's the persecuted underground church that's on fire in China, not the church that's, following the, bowing to the state to.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I've often thought that we make it too easy in America to quote, be Christian, that it's a little too easy, and people wonder, well, what's the big deal then? If it's that easy.
I mean, I
if
think
you don't think you need God. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're not in a situation where you feel like you need God, you feel like you have everything, like we are, and we are blessed to be, but it's the other side of it is, we feel like we have everything under control and we don't need anything.
And I think historically you can look at when the church is the most persecuted is when it's on fire and when it's spreading like crazy. So there is something there with being persecuted, and it may be just taking up your cross and being the example of Christ. Like, that may be what it requires to continue spreading the gospel. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting thing to bring up. I didn't want the entire podcast to be about that question. It's just I thought that was interesting to bring up, and it's an interesting movie as well.
So thinking about the global church, I had an experience during missionary service training that probably changed forever the way that I saw the global church. And it was, so to be United Methodist missionary, there's lots of steps that you have to take, but one of those is a almost 4-week kind of training. You're removed from your home context and you are just with other people who are going to be serving across the world. And you do lots of worship services, but you also do just lots of like learning how to think outside of yourself, right? Like trying to identify things that you have in your own life that you can see past, so that I don't take my culture in and only see problems through those lenses. But you get kind of close to these folks because you're all getting ready to pick up and move, and you're just sharing life. And one of the last nights there, we had eaten supper and we were sitting around, and it was a little chilly. It was in upstate New York, and somebody had built a fire. We were sitting around and we started singing "How Great Is Our God," and all of a sudden there were about 8 different languages singing the same praise song.
Well, that's not only global church across the world. That feels like you're back at Pentecost across time.
Yes. I mean, it was like even now it's chill worthy for me to even go back to that period of time and think about that. But I was sitting there thinking, I can't understand them. They could all speak English, but I couldn't understand. But we were all singing the same praises to the same God and getting ready to mightily sacrifice for the same Jesus, and that for me forever changed the way that I looked at the global church. And that group of folks were scattered all across the country. I have friends in Japan and Africa and all these different places that are going out in the name of Jesus, doing similar work that I was doing in a totally different way. And it's just, it's a real thing for me to experience the global church, and something that I wish that more people in the United States could do.
Yeah, that's a pretty awesome experience. Like, I mean, and that's probably the most concrete, like like you said, view of the global church. You can see the regathering, of like all the scattered tribes, bringing stuff back together into one family of God. Like we had the diffusion at Babel and had people coming back together into the church. That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
Speaking of Babel, did you see that Ken Ham and the Creation Museum thing? They're supposed to recreate the Tower of Babel now. Like that's the new project. Yeah.
There's no way. I don't believe you. I don't believe you.
I got it from the Holy Post. So you can fact check me, but I got it from the Holy Post, and yes, they're supposed to recreate the Tower of Babel.
Whatever.
Yeah. But I do think it's the most important thing to take from this, I guess, entire discussion in the Olympics and everything is we need to get out of the habit of viewing the church as Americans, as the American church.
Right.
And I'm sure that other nations, other countries have this problem too. You have Greek Orthodox. It's right in the name of the religion. I'm sure there's some national identities there with Russian Orthodox. There's some national identities there, and they probably struggle with some similar issues. But for us, we are so politicized that everything political is now in the church, and we see it as one thing. We see it as the American church, and all of the politics have to be in it. And we just need to get out of the habit of doing that. We need to realize that the church is global. We also need to, I think it would help in viewing, things like refugees, bringing in refugees to help them. If we start seeing them as, hey, we're actually helping brothers and sisters in Christ here. Like there's going to be Christians in these refugees. I think that helps tear down the walls. Instead of building the walls in the American church, we need to tear down the walls and start seeing other nations, other countries, the world as one big kingdom, one big church. And when we do that, I think we can be more faithful as a Christian and in our walk with Christ.
Yeah, I love the fact that the goal at the Olympics is really to do your best. That's the goal of every athlete, and very few of those athletes are going to go home with a medal, right?
Yeah,
very few, but they're all there sharing the experience and doing their best. And I really think as Christians, that's our goal too, is to do our best. The other analogy that I'll pull from sports is that as people get better at the sport, everybody else gets better too. It's the whole a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So you usually have one person or a couple athletes who push the envelope. Well, by the next 4 years going around, everybody's doing that skill, or they're running the race that fast, or they're using a different equipment. And all of a sudden, everybody's a little bit better because of that.
They literally use the iron sharpens iron in an interview on the track and field. They're with two Americans running together. It's like, is this a case of iron sharpens iron? It's like, hey, that's from Proverbs.
Yeah, I think that was the hurdles or something. But but yeah, so there are lessons to be learned every time I watch the Olympics. There are things that I learn about my faith or other people's faith that changes my view on things. So
yeah, I think that's really important in sports in general, not just Olympics, but sports in general, is that when you have two really good teams or two really good players competing against each other, they are actually improving each other's abilities in that. It's probably one of the reasons why I've always hated Tom Brady and the Patriots is because they're
jerks.
One of many
I'm just kidding.
reasons.
I'm not really.
One of the many reasons, but I always felt that, the competition was always heavy between them and Peyton Manning and the Colts, or Peyton Manning and the Broncos, Peyton Manning in general, basically. And that was always been my favorite NFL player of all time. So I was always on Team Peyton, and so I hated the Patriots and I hated Tom Brady. But looking back at it, and I actually don't despise Tom Brady as much as I did now before, but I think that he and the Patriots helped Peyton be a better player. If it wasn't for them, had he got to the level that he was, I don't know. Like, yeah, they beat him the majority of the time, but he needed that. And I think we all need that. We all need some level of competition, really, to succeed, to be the best self and the best Christian that we can be.
We need somebody to encourage us. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be competing with who has the most faith, but yeah.
Right.
But I think basketball is another great example of that. Like the competition in basketball is much more even across the globe. I mean, obviously the U.S. still has a huge advantage, but the final game that's coming up against France is not a sure thing. The games have been much closer than they used to be, and there's plenty of NBA players now that come from European leagues, and that's not an oddity. Or come from European countries that get drafted in the NBA draft. That's common.
Yeah.
That did not used to happen.
Yeah, I think there's like 2 or 3 NBA players on Team France. So, yep.
Yeah, you can definitely tell. I think back with the whole Simone Biles thing in the women's gymnastics this year. She was out there, even though she couldn't compete, she was out there encouraging even the people who would have been considered her biggest competitors.
Mm-hmm.
And even when she was back, she was still cheering all of us on. I mean, I was really proud of our American gymnasts cheering on even their harshest competitors, so that everybody did the best that they could do, because their best didn't necessarily mean you were worse. You know what I mean? So I think we forget that in the church. I think churches as a whole forget that. When one church down the street is doing something really good, then they want to compete against that. And, we need to be encouragers of one another in all that we do.
Amen. All right, Brooke, this was a really, really interesting conversation. I hope
Stacy will go back and watch some Olympics.
Yeah, I probably should. How many days do we have left?
Just a couple.
Yeah, I probably should, but
don't watch handball though.
Very good. All right. Peace be to you, and have a good night. Thank you so much for tuning in. We really hope you got some enjoyment out of the podcast this week. Remember to check out our website, www.appalachianliturgy.com, and follow us on all of our social medias. If you want an easy way to support us, though, make sure to subscribe to our channels and like our videos on YouTube. Also, join our email list for updates and let us know how we're doing. See you next week, everyone. Appalachian Liturgy Podcast is a JRS Studios production.